contrasting globalization and globalism with protectionism, right? These two contrasting things that today in our world, you'll hear it so many times, right? About the push towards protectionism or push towards globalization, and understanding the case for both, right? This whole lesson is kind of a bit of a debate between them, right? Understanding specialization, right? And what drives specialization? Two things. Two things. You have to know this for the exam.
Trade.
Come on.
Absolute and comparative advantage, right? Understanding what those things are, how they're different. Remember, both absolute and comparative advantage are what drives specialization, right? Absolute advantage is this idea that you have very straightforward, you have an absolute advantage in the production of a certain thing. Michael, look forward.
Unbelievable, this guy.
Right? So in this drives people to specialize because they have that advantage, right? You look. Make sure you understand these sorts of examples here in terms of the Canadian context about how absolute advantage drives that specialization, but also recognize that even within an area, right, you will have. It is not just like one thing. You will have different things you might specialize in and might have an advantage in. But the comparative advantages between those things will also drive you to actually not even maybe focus on something that you have an advantage in, but only those things that you truly have that advantage in. So make sure you understand that the cases for protectionism, we went over this yesterday. Remember this idea that there's still globalism. Remember this idea that globalism helps developing countries, but then the protectionists say the exact opposite, that it doesn't, right? And that the idea of you want to protect those domestic industries. An important term here, guys, is infant industries, right? This idea that if you don't focus on your own domestic production, you actually stop the whole emerging industries that are happening in your own realm, right? So make sure you understand those things there. And this idea that globalization is exploitation, right? That's that fundamental criticism of globalization. And this idea of outsourcing, make sure you understand these kind of things, right? And so some of these challenges that might be there for globalization. Imagine there's a question, for example, like, what are the challenges to globalization, right? You want to be able to then go to that, oh yeah, there's that debate between globalization and protectionism, right? And we'd want to be able to highlight, okay, what are those challenges to that whole global push, it might be helpful too if you are studying to just look at. Remember, I put these videos at the very end or connect to each lesson. If you're looking for some further, just to hammer these things home, these things are always a great resource because they basically often cover what we cover in the lesson, but just gives a little more context, right? So our next lesson after that was the environment and sustainable development. So make sure you understand what sustainable development is, right? The economic development that is conducted without the depletion of natural resources. Pretty straightforward. It's sustainable, right? It's development that isn't driven by simply taking all the resources away, but trying to make it so we actually are only using as much as we need, right? You think about our fisheries, right? How they talk about overfishing. There's all the issue of logging this old forest, right? That people would see the problem with that is it's not sustainable, right? You take this resource away and it's gone forever, right? Whereas this idea is that you do this in a way that simply it can be so that your great grandchildren can still enjoy the same resources.
Don't they have that, like sustainable logging or something?
They do this, right? They do selective logging with just flying with a helicopter, take certain trees away, and they claim that kind of selective logging actually helps the forest. it's healthy for the forest rather than
Overcrowding.
it helps the forest continue to grow. It's good for all sorts of things, right? And I think there's some really good science behind that, right? That'd be a really good example if there was a question where it's like, hey, what are some examples of sustainable development? Something like selective logging would be a good example for that, right? And this is something that, in this lesson, I tie this very much to some of your religion classes and some of that, the Catholic principles of learning, because this is something that's really big, a big part of our Catholic worldview is sustainable development. It's become huge in the Catholic Church. For all of its other faults, it's become one of the driving forces in the world towards sustainable development, right? And this is what we talk about in terms of sustainability, one of the big factors are what we call externalities. What's an externality? It's the idea that every time we do something, there's a buyer and a seller, they're interacting together, they affect things outside of each other, right? So it's called essentially like a market inefficiency, right? Because it's the idea that it's not really a closed system. Energy is being expelled outside of the system into the outside world, right? And this idea there's both positive and negative externalities. You could be producing something, and for a consumer, and that interaction can lead to the pollution of someone's backyard, and that's a negative externality. On the other hand, maybe you can do some good stuff. You help to develop a certain resource, and someone else takes advantage of that, right? So there's both these positive ways to do this and negative things. So make sure you understand that language, right, of externality, right? And you understand there's definitely two sides to that coin, big time, right? Examples of positive externalities would be stuff like, hey, if you put in the SkyTrain, you put in that Canada line, all of a sudden all these businesses along it all of a sudden benefit. All of a sudden all the housing prices go up. People are able to move closer to their work. A whole bunch of people, there's almost like billions of positive externalities that simply result from putting that one transportation line in, right? That can be a negative thing too, potentially, right? Maybe it brings in like crime or something like this into an area that didn't have it before, right? It can go both ways, right? Or if you do develop an area, maybe all of a sudden, okay, you're developing this resource, all of a sudden a whole town builds up around that whole factory and manufacturing that you're doing. If you see Nomadland, that's a good example of it, right? This idea that you do this stuff and the whole town builds up around that certain area. That's a great movie though, but watch it if you haven't seen it yet.
Pete Triponis to room 106 immediately. Pete to room 106 immediately.
I swear there's way too much use of this thing.
Yeah, he's always getting called.
He gets called like once a week at least.
So negative externalities. I'll say this, guys. Normally, when we talk about externalities, particularly when it comes to sustainable development, we're often talking about negative externalities, right? Stuff like oil spill, the BP oil spill. They're just trying to do business. Yeah.
Can I go to the washroom?
Yes.
No.
They're just trying to do business, and what do? They don't keep up to their safety or whatever their practice they have to do. They end up destroying a whole environmental area. All of a sudden, the fishermen who made their life like fishing that land all of a sudden can't do it, right? And it creates all these sorts of their kids. Don't get to go to college, right? You think of almost the web of negative externalities. That kid would have invented nuclear fission or something like this, right? Or fusion, I guess, right? All these negative externalities can result in that we don't get clean power, right? All this kind of stuff, right? We end up relying upon coal, right? It's like a crazy web of like one thing leading to another, leading to another, leading to another, right? Traffic congestion. Hey, That's a negative externality. That's what's happened here, right? They've developed the North Shore, put up all these high-rise buildings and all these houses, and built out into West Van, and then all this kind of stuff, and they didn't really think about the transportation whatsoever, and so you have this horrific, nightmarish, apocalyptic, soul-destroying kind of traffic congestion, right? Every day, right? Toxic waste dumping, greenhouse, this is obviously a big one today. We're just doing business, we're just driving to work, and what are we doing? We're killing the earth, right? We don't even realize it half the time, right? Solid waste disposal, and even noise, right, can be considered to be a negative externality. What is the dilemma, right? I remember we talked about Pope Francis's language of the throwaway culture, right? And so that's important language for you guys to know. The idea of that throwaway culture. And remember, in a throwaway culture, what Francis is talking about is not just like, a wrapper that we throw away and it goes to a landfill, right? Or it's not just like we take our phone, we have it like 3 years and then we throw it away, right? It's not that, just that, yes, that's part of the throwaway culture for sure. But one thing that he's really trying to point is that we also often use people in the same way that we do in this whole throwaway culture, right? It's this idea that we treat people as expendable, consumable things, whether it's people working in those sweatshops, right? Or maybe even the way we treat people in stores, that person who is helping us in some retail store, we just see them as a means to an end, something to be consumed rather than a valuable a soul, right? And so he would say that this is something that is leading to so many problems within our culture. If we could just stop treating everything as throwaway, but rather something to be nurtured and sustained. People, things, our environment, all this kind of stuff, maybe we could have a much more sustainable world, right? The idea is that the more we move away from a throwaway culture, the more sustainable our world becomes. Seeing our world, our whole world is something to consume, right? Rather than to be something to nurture. Some great quotes in there. And this is the dilemma, right? I drew here in this lesson a pretty stark picture of what this throwaway culture looks like, right? It looks like global warming. It looks like all sorts of problems, right? And this idea that this is irreversible very soon, right? That maybe we might be hitting a point where we have, we have not just this, but we have this idea of a runaway carbon cycle, which it can happen. It's happened on other planets, right? Remember, I used the example of it's happened on Venus. This is what happened on Venus, right? A runaway carbon cycle, and the whole calthrate gun hypothesis that maybe we have already pulled the trigger on this calthrate gun, and we're going to see a huge release of carbon coming up from our oceans over the next 100 years. And it can be a problem. So how do we solve the dilemma? Remember, I introduced Robert Malthus to you, who had a very similar perspective to good old Thanos, whatever you guys call him these days. He was this guy who, in some sense, saw some of the same issues that Marx saw. Remember? Right? He saw that industrial revolution. He's kind of living at a similar time, right? And he thought, he kind of predicted that this was going to lead to absolute economic human disaster, right? He governed that Adam Smith's view of a world governed by natural laws. He predicted that the world would only become more and more impoverished to the realities of population growth and the lack of resources. So he was dealing with that, with the economic problem. He thought that fundamental to that economic problem was the problem not only of a lack of resources, but also of food production, right? Because of population growth, right? He believed that we need food. It's true. He was right. But he also believed that humans would simply just reproduce exponentially like rabbits. They would just eat Thanos. Yeah, he would just get more and more, we would just get more and more populous, and we would just lead to complete crisis, right? This is why certain governments, China, for example, has made their one-child policy, right? Because this was the belief for a long time of the Malthusian dilemma.
Bill Gates
Retail
has
policy.
Malthusian beliefs.
Even Bill Gates, a lot of people, Prince Philip as well, who recently passed away, he also was a Malthusian. He thought actually he believed that population growth was the fundamental challenge to our world, right? So,
we don't do force abortion now,
guys.
You have to pay a lot of money.
So how did Malthus think we were going to solve the fundamental problem facing us? Right, this is good. It could be a question. Explain Malthus's view of the world, right, and how he thought he could solve it, right? Through education, he thought education, teaching people different practices around reproduction could be a way to do it. Through forms of contraception, Malthus was one of the big arguers for the use of contraception in England and Europe, and by limiting the number of children individuals can have by different social classes. So, depending on what class you are, you can maybe have different numbers of children, right? Was he right? What do we do then? What do we do today, right? That was what Malthus thought could solve this problem. How do we solve environmental destruction without some sort of theory? What do we do today in behavioral economics? We do stuff like subsidies, right? We subsidize certain things that produce the outcome that we want in terms of sustainable. So the more sustainable companies will get subsidized, right? For even think what we do in terms of Malthusian problem, maybe we don't subsidize people with large families, right? We do a little bit more now. We didn't for a long time. The more children you had, there was just less and less help available to you, right? What does it mean that Canada has started to give the child tax credit? Does it mean that maybe we just feel like we need a bigger population that might actually help us? Is there kind of a Malthusian sort of equation behind that? I wonder, right? We definitely subsidize stuff we want. We tax stuff we don't like, right? We put taxes on gasoline, on cigarettes, on sugar, on all this kind of stuff, everything we don't like. Sugar leads to heart disease, which leads to medical bills, right?
Tax the poor.
Right, we tax stuff we don't like. This is called a Pigouvian tax, right? You want to stop people using something? Why don't you just put a crazy tax on it and they don't use it anymore? Unfortunately,
Hey, Luke just made a racist
Bring it back.
comment.
guys,
She brought up a scarring memory of my people's history. The Chinese head tax.
I don't know what that is.
What? You might be the most
Sure,
racist
Barbara.
person.
I'll bring my hair straight tomorrow, maybe.
Did you not watch Mr.
Guys, quiet. Let's continue on. What do people say about this? Well, the problem is, you aren't you just internalizing the externality, right? You get people to pay for it. It doesn't really stop it, right? Are you really ever stopping it through this kind of stuff, right? That's a question in terms of taxes, right? And often, where do those taxes go to? Are they just going to line the pockets of politicians, or are they actually stopping? Are they going towards fixing the fault of this? And is the government even just making money off that horrible thing? Is that what they're doing, right? They do that sometimes. I think with maybe stuff like cigarettes. Maybe they just, hey, this is a good way to make money. Let's just tax it, right? Alcohol, this kind of stuff, right? One thing they also do is regulate, right? They introduce all sorts of regulations. You can only use this much of this. You could only produce this much of this pollutant into our world, right? Through regulation, they think you can actually create a more sustainable world.
But if you deregulate, it can lead to bad things.
It can lead to bad.
Crisis.
It can lead to the financial crisis, right? They claim, some people believe deregulation is the way to stimulate the economy. Other people have said, hey, it always seems to lead us human greed runs away, and it creates problems. And in environmental issues, we see regulation as a valuable tool for dealing with human nature. Other things we use, tort law. Do you guys remember what tort law is?
Yes.
What's tort law?
Suing people.
It's suing people. How does it work?
I want to sue you, so I'm going to engage in a legal altercation with you.
What exactly is a tort? How is it different than other sorts of lawsuits? Absolutely. Jay is absolutely right. A tort is this idea that someone has been harmed. A tort is this idea that someone has been harmed, and all that lawsuit does is seek to restore them to where they were beforehand, right? And all these sorts of incentives, pollution credits, that's what we're using quite a bit right now with the carbon credits. Cultural change, activism is obviously a big thing, and advertising. Could there be better solutions? What are the fundamental criticisms of Malthus? Well, it wasn't quite right. Technological breakthroughs came along, helped us produce all the food we need, and all of a sudden, also living in cities has kind of made people not want to have as many kids too, right? So his theories didn't seem to pan out, right? In the way here, and so the question that kind of brings up. Is technology the solution here? Is it always going to solve our problems, or will cultural change save us? Okay, so we've gone through now, guys. Remember, our first lesson was on postmodernism and behavioral economics, right? Second was on globalization and globalism, and third was on the environment and sustainable development. And then we have two more lessons, right? Equity and income distribution, and then the collapse, dystopias, and dark. There was two more. There's 5. There was 6. I took out 1. Right? You did cover that. This is just review.
Okay.
Michael, where are you today?
I don't know.
Okay.
I thought we slowly go over that stuff. I was like,
Okay. No, we've gone over all the material we're going to go over in this class. Equity. Remember, this is this crazy term we use so much today. You hear about equity all the time, right? It's used different ways. All these different ways creates kind of a difficulty for us to understand what equity truly is, right? And this way I defined it. Make sure you understand this, right? Equity is a distribution that is just and fair. We recognize that it follows all our customs, all our expectations, and we understand that it solves that fundamental thing within us that simply wants a fair shake, wants a fair deal for us, right? Yes, that's a different kind of equity. This is a different kind of equity. This kind of Michael has brought up the idea that equity is used in banking. Equity is like whatever you own after all the capital you own after you're taking into consideration the liabilities, right? This is very different. In equity, we're talking about all of us being treated fairly, having a society where there aren't people out there that are being abused, right? Where everyone has an opportunity to truly live a good life, right? Marx said this, right? When we talk about Marxism, right? But is Marxism equitable, right? That's a question, right? Is capitalism fundamentally, is Adam Smith's view of self-interest leading to the common good benefit of all, is that truly equitable? Does that lead to that just and fair solution for all? Right, I wonder, right? Remember, one way, how do we try to figure this out? How do we measure equity and the quality of life within a society? How do we figure out how people are doing in relation to other people? We have the Human Development Index, right, that the United Nations publishes, and it's this idea that they take a whole bunch of stuff, right? You can see here's the Human Development Index right here. They take all this kind of stuff and they calculate which countries are doing best in terms of their quality of life, right? and there Norway right there is at the very top.
Wait, what's number 2?
So in Ireland apparently,
China.
Hong
Hong
Kong,
Kong.
Iceland.
We're
We're
Duncan 15.
They're literally all left.
we're somewhere over here, 16. I
Ha!
think.
We're
Well,
half
doesn't that tell you
America.
something?
Yeah, by like a thousandth of a decimal. Like,
Yeah, yeah. And they also are taking care of a lot more people too.
Yeah.
America?
Yeah, they have a lot of illegal immigrants bringing down the index.
So and one thing else that we were interested in are these two things, these two different measures of poverty, right, in the world, right? So we see ourselves, there we are at the 16th, in the whole world amongst all those countries. It seems like we're doing pretty good, we're doing pretty well, right? Right? And so what some people might say, those who believe in the existence of absolute poverty, that we're all poverty compared with a state of absolute destitution. Say, hey, Canada's doing awesome. We don't need to care about the poor here in Canada because the poor here are better off than some of the rich in other developing countries, right? We're all pretty good, right? And what some people claim though is that approach fails to understand the disparity, the inequities that exist within our own society. And so they claim, yes, absolute poverty might be true to some degree, but we have to still take consideration of relative poverty, that even in Canada there is huge disparities of opportunities, right? Huge disparities of access, right? There are people who might not have access to the same resources as others, and therefore can never achieve the same ends that other people can achieve, right? Right? And what we do in Canada, what Stats Canada does, is they draw this line called the poverty line, right? Which defines that any household that spends 50% of her average average before tax income on necessities is seen as at the poverty line, right? The more of your average income you are spending purely on necessities without opportunities to save or to have other things, right? Then you are then living, and we would define it as impoverished. People would say, hey, from an absolute poverty standpoint, say, wow, come on, Canada's doing pretty good there. Why are you even drawing that line, right? In other countries, it's probably like 95% or 100% of their income is spending on necessities. Aren't Canadians just being kind of ridiculous? But from a relative standpoint, we see this, Stats Canada would see this as where people are then not having the same abilities and opportunities as other people, right? We use this line to help to understand also as Canada goes on, are we doing better than we were doing before? Has the poverty line shifted? Are there less people living below the poverty line than before, right? And it's important for us to understand that, right? And remember, necessities are just like food and like housing. And of course, one thing we'd say too, in this world today, I imagine there's lots of professionals my age who are living actually below the poverty line, right? They're basically spending all their money on rent, right? I saw recently what like the rent in my building would be if I was renting my apartment, and I can't even imagine it, right?
Remember you bought the building?
Sorry?
You bought the building?
No, like it was like a similar apartment to mine, right? It would be like I think it was like $3,500 like a month, right? Just to rent, right? Like, and even if you split that, it's still 15 plus 1750 a month, right? Per person, right? Right? For a lot of people, that's half their monthly income right there, right? Just spent on rent. That's someone living probably beneath the poverty line, right? And a lot of people are doing that, right? You see, remember, here's some examples of, hey, a lot of singles, right, in that age range are definitely, particularly in Vancouver, guys, I would almost think that there's more people living below the poverty line in Vancouver than ever before. I don't know that's for sure, but just like with the way housing prices and rent is going up, it forces people to not be able to save money, not to invest, not to do any of that kind of stuff, right?
Mr. Barber,
Work longer, not retire, yeah.
then would you say this is the reason why like people would move in with like their boyfriend or girlfriend? Like
100%.
earlier
That drives a lot of that changes of behavior. Hey, I'll tell you this, guys. A reality check. It's really hard in Vancouver to ever rent on your own, right? Ever, right? Because also, how are you ever going to save up money to be able to buy a place? You have to basically, you almost have to be like a lawyer or a doctor to be able to not,
That's student loan.
yeah. It's true. Remember, guys, here a lot of people also with disabilities are living below the poverty line, right? And immigrants and a lot of the various people like that. Poverty. What is poverty? How we talk about poverty? What do we really mean by that, right? Really important question. We see it all around us, right? One thing we talked about. Remember, guys, really important language. And when you go to university, all of you guys going to university very soon, you're going to hear about socioeconomic status all the time. It's this really important concept today. It's this idea. Remember, I used that example. I talked about how someone, the moment they talk to you, within 5 seconds, I think it is, or something, they will have a good idea of what, and their brain will get them to figure out what your social economic class is. Simply by the way you talk, right? They'll hear you talking, and they can often figure out what your parents did for a living. Do you come from a white collar background, a blue collar background, an impoverished background? Where geographically do you come from? What education do you have? People can figure that all out very, very, very quickly, right? Simply by the way you talk, right? And the way you dress, right? They'll know all those kinds of education, occupation, all that kind of stuff. Simply by, because the idea is that human beings are like, we're not very good at lots of things, right? We're very good at reading socioeconomic status, right? Yes, sure. There's these invisible lines all around us, barriers that help to determine what is possible in terms of life, right? Yeah, that person who is homeless, like there's all these barriers to beyond the material, right? Simply in terms of the way we interpret that person, right? And everything they do, right? We talked about the working poor and the welfare poor, right? These are two different types of poverty we have within our nation. And I pointed out that there's lots of impoverished places around us, right? How do we fight poverty? What do we do? This idea in Canada is we live.
Get rid of
We live, guys.
Yeah, no, it's pretty drafting.
We live in this welfare state, right? Where it's this idea that what is the welfare state? It's this idea that we use these social programs and financial transfers to help out those who are poor. So the idea is that there's a safety net. Those people who are living below the poverty line, there's never a point where anyone in Canada should go hungry or not have the resources to be able to have housing and stuff like this. The idea is that we have a safety net that provides this stuff, right? What does this look like? One part of that, sorry, I almost jumped over it, is the progressive taxation system, right? That as you get into higher income, you then pay more taxes, right? And that is a way for us to apparently to create a more equitable situation in Canada, to kind of even out the income so that people who aren't making as much income have access to stuff, right? And remember, there's two different types of strategies. There are structural strategies and relief strategies. Should you know this?
Yes.
Yes, right? What are the structural strategies and relief strategies? Remember, structural strategies are stuff like what you're doing right now, right? Yeah, it's the idea that, if we give every Canadian child an opportunity, and if they're all forced to get a certain level of education, it will help to alleviate poverty within Canada. It didn't used to be like that. You didn't have to go to school. Now you have to. And the reason for it is a part of this structural strategy to deal with poverty, right? Daycare, enabling parents to be able to work, right, and have to keep their kids in daycare. Having affordable daycare is seen as this important strategy, right? People who are uber rich, don't often need daycare because one parent can
Wow.
no 1%. One parent can stay at home, or they have an au pair or whatever they have, right? To take care of the kids, right? Right? Daycare is seen as a tool to even the playing field, right? Increasing employability, right? Getting more training out there available, and also the number one thing probably of all is trying to create more employment opportunities so people get out of poverty, get out of like minimum wage paying jobs, and have more opportunities. So, and what are relief strategies? Stuff like welfare benefits, seniors benefits, Canadian pension plan. These sorts of things often involve simply, this is, remember, teaching a man to fish or a woman to fish. This is giving them a fish, right?
I
Because
can catch you a fish and you can be fed this evening, or I can teach you how to fish.
Teach you how to
the
fish.
rest of your life.
yes, right. And but there's this idea that yes, we need to teach people to fish, but if they're starving right now, they need food and clothing and all that kind of stuff. Right now, this is what this stuff is for, right? Emerging challenges. Okay, our last. There's too much noise. Okay, our last guys. Guys, this is ridiculous. So remember, our last lesson we talked about was on, we were going to have another lesson that I basically cut out, right? But so we ended unfortunately we ended up on a pretty negative note, which is this danger, right, of future economic collapse, right? That we are maybe on the verge, or potentially on the verge of future collapse, economic collapse. How do we think through this? We talked about, all these economic collapses. Of course, we've talked about the black swan theory as well. It's going to be really important for you to know. But economic sustainability,
I would just say that it's good to end on a bad note because it is the dismal science.
It is the dismal science. This is true. I like it. Okay.
Yeah, no, I like it, yeah.
It's a good note.
And it's true that often we do, often those more utopian ideas, it's hard to even think about them because they're often not what happens, right? Right. Economic stability is more of an exception than the rule. We talked about all these examples of these are just a handful of the examples just in the last century of economic crises, right? And they seem to be getting worse. We're not better. They're more widespread, and they often shake economies to their core in a way that they never did before, right? And what's scary about this, guys, is it often leads to all this, right? And possibly to violence, right? Right, we talked about underground economies, the black market versus the gray market. You guys understand that. We talked about cryptocurrency, so there's definitely going to be some questions on the exams around the way money is changing, right? So make sure you understand blockchain technology, right? This idea that why is the blockchain good? Well, everyone is looking for trust. They want something they can trust, right? And they see blockchain as an ability to create a system that's decentralized, not based around some sort of a government giving it some sort of credence, but people simply trust the system, right? People trust the technology itself. The technology means that governments can't control these things in the way they used to, right? And why is it trustable? Why is it trusted is a better word, right? Because it's distributed, everyone has a copy of it. Everyone knows the ledger, right? Once you've changed it, once it's been changed, it can't be unchanged. And what this means, if someone falsifies a ledger, it'll get caught within this whole distributed system, right? And because you can only change this one ledger, you can't just fiddle with it. It's an immutable thing, and it's also unanimous. Everyone, it's end-to-end encryption. Everyone engages with it anonymously, right? It's seen as secure due to this encryption, right? People love the idea that you can actually, use this stuff and not have your transactions tracked, right? And it's also programmable, right? That's the big thing with it, is that you can maybe, because there's no banks involved, there's no red tape, there's nothing like that, you can actually do whatever you want and program it however you want. You have pure freedom to program it however you want, and the system allows for that, and the system is built to sustain that programmability, right? And is crypto the future? When we talk about this, technologies that succeed, that overthrow other technologies are either both simple or can be trusted, right? They're either more trusted or more simple. The best technologies are both. You can do that same thing in a more simple way, and it's more reliable, right? That's why people moved, even though Napster was free, right? Right, this was free. The what's it called? Like the torrenting was free, right? And yet people moved away from this technology because Apple Music, Spotify, these things were just more easy and more reliable, right? People will pay money for this, right? This is what makes technology good, and this is what we talk in terms of the future of money. Whatever comes along that's going to be more simple and more trustable will be better, right? It's going to, of course, there'll be some sort of digital idea, but the whole issue of what the future is, and could there be a question around what is the future of money, and explain? Yes, right? That would be a good question for the exam for sure. And this is the challenge, though, right, that comes from this, is we're at the cusp of a monumental battle between an increasingly decentralized economic system. At the same time, the power and reach of government is greater than we could ever imagine. So we see this arms race, right, between a more encrypted, decentralized world and governments that have tools. I heard in the news that in the States, it's come out that the American government has this vast facial recognition network that just is being leaked. That as they're walking around, they're using all these cameras to actually, see who you are, right? And this is the challenge, right? Between being free to make our own economic choices and having to conform to the economic system that tried to maintain some overall equity, some better outcome for all. This challenge between independence and order, which is going to come more and more. As you go on in your life, you will see this challenge increase. Hey, you have more ability to be independent economically and to do things outside of these tightly controlled systems. Absolutely, but at the same time, those systems will come much more powerful and potent in their ability to control you, right? And what we talk about in relation to this is this idea of the black swan, right? Is that at the same time there's that battle going on between independence and order, there's always another black swan that can come around and overthrow that whole balance, right? This idea that there's always stuff that we assume is impossible. It's outside of our rationality. Our rationality is a bounded rationality. When we talked about that, right? In the first lesson, the idea of a bounded rationality. And what that means is that there can always be something that comes along and completely arrests what we assume is simply the reality, right? This has been seen in all sorts of ways. It's mathematically true, in fact, right? That we can never know what is real in terms of numbers and certainly in terms of economic situations, right? And remember what happens here. This is where some of you guys struggled a little bit with your explorative reflection, right? Is that there's always an outlier, comes out from anywhere. We don't even know what it is. Second, it carries an extreme impact, right? And changes our whole world, right? Third, This is the big thing, guys, right? Is what do we do after the fact? We rationalize it. We tell stories that make it seem like, oh, there was always a black swan. We always knew there was a black swan, right? We try to explain it and rationalize it, right? Maybe that's what McNamara was doing with the whole fog of war, right? Isn't the whole fog of war really just him trying to rationalize? Yeah. Sure. Right? Yeah.
What is the example of black swan?
So like a good example of black swan would be something like cryptocurrency. Right? Coming along, right? We never, if you told me as when I was your age that something like crypto, I could have never imagined it. Right? That kind of technology, never imagined, and now look what's entered our world. Completely challenging. And you guys, just yesterday, the government recovered a huge amount of Bitcoin that they had given as a what do you call it, like as a ransom to that ransomware attack on that the pipeline, and that completely changed everybody's life. I spent a whole bunch of money on gas because of that. People had to shift the way they were spending and driving and all this kind of stuff because of that, right? Bitcoin is radically changing our world at almost every single level, right? New digital currencies, new ways of doing this stuff is transforming us, right? And that's going to happen again after again and again. The internet would be a good example, right? All these things would be an example of wow. Amazon, right? Who could have predicted Amazon? Almost no one, right? And it's the idea that it's always going to come and transform us, right? So this is a question, this is a challenge that kind of ended off, I guess, our whole class. How can we even do economics in the face of black swans, right? Is this whole class almost a futile thing, right? Is economics a futile task, right? Because of the existence of the black swan. And if you want to, it might be helpful for you even as you study to look at the video where Talib actually explains his whole theory of the black swan. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Everyone good? Okay, so that is where we ended, right? So, you guys have any questions at all?
Yeah.
What's your question? Yes.
So you're saying that this exam is going to be pretty much a Unit 3 test with like just a bit of
Right,
Unit
so-
1 and 2?
So I'd say it's about 2/3. So I shifted it up so it has more of Unit 3 than I would have planned initially, right? And so it's about 2/3. The exam is 80 marks, right? 50 of those marks are from short answer, and 30 marks are from long answer.
No multiple choice?
No multiple choice. There's 50. So the first part of it looks very much like one of your unit tests. The way it's different is on the end. There are two. Just hold up 1 second. There are two long answer questions that one of them I've given to you, right? It's you're given a choice to respond to one of the questions from the debate. On the second long answer question, you are given another choice of a series of other stuff to describe. Luke and then Sienna.
Do we have to draw one of those like graphs?
There's no graphing on
There's
this.
no drawing.
No drawing.
Do I need my graphing calculator?
So you said 2 long answers.
Yep.
Oh, no.
You don't have short answers.
A log act.
Approximately 34.
A log act.
Barbs, are you sure you don't want to take out some of the short answer
Very
and add a
close.
multiple
Wait,
choice?
just wait, just wait.
My God, there's nothing.
What?
Just like.
So Barbara, can I use the
Answer
washroom?
just like answer. No. How many questions
The
are
red
there?
We
dragon.
gotta pull it up right here.
No, I know. I just need to draw a few questions.
Okay. Okay. Yes. That's what it's doing.
No,
Yeah, answer my question.
That's not
Or else.
What did I just watch?
I don't know, I was watching watching it longer than
There's
you.
15 short answer questions.
15? How much time do we get?
You have you choose the whole time. You hold it 2 hours.
That's my long term. Are you sure?
Yes. They're short answers. So for example, like this, it's roughly, so say for example, like in our unit, on average, it took the average person about an hour. Maybe a little under an hour, right? So it's like that, with one less question. One less question, and then these 2 long answer questions. So what you do is I usually spend half an hour on long answer questions. Sure. Well, any other questions? Definitely yes. Oh, sure. So let me just say this, guys. So the way, guys, what on earth is going on?
I love that. I wish I was there.
Anthony, Kara, can you grab a seat?
Yes. Are we not working on our things?
I will. I was just going to give you a little bit more guidance on your test.
Diet.
So the way I've approached making the exam is I basically took my unit 3. I took both the exam that I had and I took my unit 3 test and I brought them together, right? So the good way to think about it is what I've done is I took out a lot of the more specific questions that related to the other units, and what questions are there are more broader about our whole class that you've studied. So if you think about the test like it's looking at the whole of our class, so it's looking at Unit 3, but then making sure that Unit 3 then is making connections out to the broader class. So questions like, hey, should you know, okay, yes, this unit we talked about behavioral economics. Should you know about how behavioral economics relates to economics in general? And what is economics, right? Why is it important? These sorts of questions. Should you know those things? Yes, right? That you know that kind of focus, right? Is it connecting this unit out to the broader thing? Should you focus, I would say like 80 to 90% of your study on learning the 3rd unit? Absolutely. Because I think I would hope some of the content in that's connected to the broader class, we've hammered home like 50 billion times already. You already know.
Do we need to know like all the details about the economists and like different types of economies, like stuff like
No, I
that?
don't
No.
think so. No.
So it's like
Only on a broader sense. Like, definitely, if you think, for example, about the long answer question we were talking about, say, capitalism versus Marxism, right? You want to prepare, make sure you understand these things, right? But definitely, I would say, definitely make sure your focus is on the 3rd unit, but also making sure you have a good sense of that broader journey we've gone on in this class. Sure. Jennifer, Make sure you also think about
Further away.
the short answer question. Remember for the first short answer question, long answer. I don't just believe that they're one of the well, I'll do this. How about this? Guys, sit down. Yep. Just give me a second, guys. I can't do everything for everyone. I'm trying to show you.
Sorry, I was just asking to go to the washroom.
So, I want to show you what the first long answer question looks like, okay?
You guys behave? You guys hot water? I tried so I'm sorry. No, I look at you
So everybody look up here. So this is what this is the first long answer question right here, just so everyone is clear, right?
Oh my god.
Right?
Can you make it bigger?
Wait, this is on the exam?
Yeah. Right? So this is what I told you as a right. So this is one of those things. So this gives you a sense to what the second long answer question is, the format that it also is, right? So choose one of the following debate topics and argue a position in your own words and exploration, right? First, capitalism leads to an unhappy and alienated workforce. The government should just let the economy be, or in the long run, technology will solve all our problems. Those are three debates. So this is what the first one looks like. That's for 15 marks. The other one is for 15 marks as well. That make sense to everyone?
And what's the other one like to do with? Like is that on your
The other one is more, it's a little bit broader out for the whole class. The whole.
You're back.
Okay?